Robert Hayes is the kind of man people whisper about. Reclusive, powerful, untouchable. A millionaire CEO who built an empire of knowledge but lives utterly alone. But one rainy afternoon, that solitude is broken. Two 7-year-olds, a twin brother and sister, walk into his sleek Manhattan office, not to beg, but to make an offer. With solemn eyes and trembling voices, they hand him a handwritten note. We sell books. We read aloud. We want to save our dad. Please help. What Robert doesn't expect is the worn bookmark tucked into their bag, one identical to the one his late wife left behind years ago. Why do these children carry that symbol of his past? What connection ties their fate to his? Their father is dying. Their hope is vanishing. But their courage just might restore a broken man's soul. Don't miss this story of heartache, second chances, and the unexpected ways love finds its way back. Subscribe now for more true, emotional stories that will stay with you long after the video ends. The receptionist at Hayes Global froze mid-sentence when she looked up and saw them. Two children, no taller than her desk, stood side by side, shoulders squared, eyes wide but determined. They couldn't have been more than 7. The girl held a worn tote bag. The boy clutched a folded piece of paper. "We'd like to speak to Mr. Robert Hayes," the girl said clearly, her voice polite but unwavering. The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry, sweetie. Mr. Hayes doesn't take walk-in appointments. We brought books," the boy interrupted, holding out the paper, "and a note." From his glass-paneled office high above Midtown, Robert Hayes was unaware that his day and life was about to change. He sat behind a massive oak desk, eyes fixed on quarterly reports he had already read twice, distracted by a silence that clung to his walls like dust. The phone hadn't rung in over an hour. He didn't notice. He rarely noticed the quiet anymore. He had grown used to it, built a fortress around it. Then came a soft knock. Janet, his assistant, peeked in, looking unsure for the first time in years. "There are 2 children here, sir. They're asking to speak with you." Robert raised a brow. "Children?" "They say they have a business proposition." That made him pause. 2 minutes later, Ella and Owen stood before the wealthiest man in the city, dwarfed by the leather chairs they sat in. Robert studied them silently. The boy's hair stuck up in the back. The girl's hands were calloused in a way no 7-year-olds should be. The girl handed him the note. It was written in pencil, printed in uneven block letters. "We sell books. We read aloud. We want to save our dad. Please help." He read it twice. "You wrote this?" he asked softly. Ella nodded. "I dictated. Owen wrote." Robert looked from one child to the other. "You want to save your father." Owen sat straighter. "He needs heart surgery. The doctor said it's really expensive." "We thought if we worked, maybe someone would help," Ella added quickly. "We don't want charity." Robert leaned back in his chair, masking the ache that formed in his chest. "And you think I'm the person who can help?" Ella nodded again. "You were in the newspaper. The librarian read it out loud. It said, 'You're the smartest and richest man in New York.' So, we came." "You walked here?" he asked. "We took 2 buses, then walked the rest," Owen said, trying to sound proud. Robert felt the air in the room shift. Something invisible but profound was happening. He cleared his throat. "Where are your parents now?" "Our mom. She passed away when we were little," Ella said, her voice quiet now. "Our dad's in the hospital. He used to build furniture. Now he can't get out of bed." "And you live?" "In a storage unit behind Mr. Larry's shop," Owen answered. "He lets us sleep there 'cause Dad used to fix stuff for him." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that pressed against the ribs. Robert folded the note and placed it on his desk carefully, as if it were fragile. "I'm sorry," he said, the words unfamiliar in his mouth. "That must be very hard." "We're okay," Ella said quickly. "We have books." Robert glanced at the tote bag. "May I?" She nodded. Inside were 6 paperbacks, some torn at the corners. One was held together with tape. On the inside of each cover was a handwritten sticker. Ella and Owen's Book Company. Pay what you can. "They're our favorites," Owen said. "We read them to people in the park. Sometimes they give us quarters." Robert let out a breath that trembled slightly. He hadn't felt something in his chest shift like this in a long, long time. "Do you have someone looking after you while your father's in the hospital?" he asked. "No," Ella answered. "But we're really good at keeping time. And we only go out in pairs. And we never talk to strangers, except today." That last part made her glance at Owen with a shy smile. Robert couldn't help it. He smiled too. And for a moment, he wasn't the man on the cover of Fortune magazine. He was just someone watching. 2 brave children fight for something he had long ago stopped believing in: hope. He reached for the phone and pressed a button. "Janet," he said quietly. "Clear my afternoon." Then, turning to the twins, he leaned forward. "Would you two mind showing me where your dad is?" Robert Hayes had signed billion-dollar contracts without blinking. He had stared down ruthless competitors across boardroom tables and made decisions that shaped entire industries. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the quiet determination in Ella and Owen's eyes. He adjusted the collar of his coat and followed the twins through the glass lobby of Hayes Global. The doorman offered a questioning glance as Robert stepped outside on foot, but the CEO only nodded, focused. The city's cold breath swept through the street, tugging at Owen's thin jacket. Robert frowned. "Do you have gloves?" he asked as they waited at a crosswalk. "No," Owen replied, "but we keep our hands in our sleeves. That works okay." Robert instinctively removed his own gloves and gently handed them to the boy. "Here, take these." Owen looked up surprised. "But they're yours." "They're warm," Robert said simply. "And right now, that's what matters." They moved through the city's pulse, past shuttered storefronts, graffiti-tagged walls, and the warm glow of bodegas with steam fogging their windows. The gleam of Fifth Avenue faded behind them as the buildings grew smaller, the sidewalks more cracked. "We live near the mechanic shop," Ella explained, pointing down a narrow alleyway. "Mr. Larry lets us use the back room. It smells like tires, but it's safe." Robert didn't speak. He didn't trust his voice. "And our dad," Owen added, "he's in St. Vincent's, the one by the train tracks." Robert knew the place. It wasn't a hospital. It was a holding cell for those who had nowhere else to go. Understaffed, underfunded, forgotten. "We go every day after school," Ella continued. "Sometimes he's awake and smiles. Sometimes he sleeps a lot. We just read to him." Robert glanced at her and noticed something strange, something that made his chest tighten. She had the same quiet strength his late wife Margaret once carried, that blend of softness and steel. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Finally, they reached the corner of 86th and Ash. A chain-link fence surrounded a crumbling building with a faded sign, St. Vincent's Medical Clinic. Owen pushed the door open. The receptionist barely looked up. "They're here to see Mr. John Carter," Ella said with practiced confidence. The woman waved them through. "Room 214, down the hall and left." Robert followed, his shoes echoing too loudly on the linoleum floor. Inside room 214, time seemed suspended. John Carter lay motionless on a rusted bed frame, his skin pale against the flat hospital sheets. An oxygen tube ran beneath his nose. Machines beeped softly beside him. He looked no older than Robert, mid-40s, maybe younger, but completely worn down. Ella stepped closer and touched her father's hand. "Daddy?" she whispered gently. "This is Mr. Robert. He's the one we told you about." John stirred faintly. His eyes fluttered, but didn't open. "He can help," Owen said. "We brought our best books and our note." Robert looked at the cracked tile floor, then slowly approached the bedside. He pulled the children's paper from his coat pocket and placed it gently on the table next to a chipped plastic water cup. "I'll make sure he gets the care he needs," Robert said quietly. "That's a promise." Ella smiled with quiet relief. For the first time in what felt like decades, Robert didn't feel like a businessman. He felt like a man who had stumbled into something bigger than himself, something that couldn't be negotiated or acquired. On the way out, he stopped at the nurse's station. "Who's the attending physician on Carter in room 214? He asked, voice clipped with purpose. The nurse blinked. "Dr. Feldman, but there's not much we can do. He's uninsured. His condition's serious. He needs a surgical team and ICU care, not—" "I want him transferred," Robert said firmly. "Today. To Lenox Hill. Private room. Cardiac ICU. I'll cover everything." The nurse gaped. You're serious?" "I don't make suggestions. I give instructions," he said, handing over his card. "Make the call." Then he turned back to the twins, who stood quietly by the exit, watching him with eyes full of something fragile. Trust. "Let's get you two something warm to eat," he said, suddenly aware of how little they'd had. Owen's stomach growled in agreement. They ended up at a corner diner. It wasn't fancy, just pancakes and grilled cheese, but the kids' laughter at the red vinyl booth was more satisfying than any five-star meal Robert had ever paid for. "Do you always help strangers?" Ella asked between bites. "No," Robert admitted, "but maybe I should start." Owen looked thoughtful. "You don't feel like a stranger anymore." Robert's throat tightened. Outside, the sky turned amber with the setting sun. Something in him, something buried for years, began to stir. He didn't know where this path would lead, but as he looked at the two children smiling at him from across the booth, he knew this much. He wouldn't walk away. The next morning, Robert arrived at Lenox Hill Hospital just after sunrise. He wore no tie, no suit jacket, just a navy sweater and the gravity of a man whose life had changed overnight. John Carter had been moved to a private room on the 10th floor. Outside the room, Robert paused, listening. Inside, machines hummed quietly, and a nurse was adjusting an IV bag. She nodded when she saw him. "He's stable for now," she said gently. "Surgery is scheduled for Friday morning, but he's awake, barely." The children stayed until late. Robert thanked her with a nod and stepped inside. John's face had more color today, though his body remained still, as if afraid to believe in hope. Robert pulled a chair close and sat silently, watching the rise and fall of a man who meant the world to two brave children. Then he noticed it. On the bedside table, next to a worn paperback copy of Charlotte's Web, lay a laminated bookmark. It had frayed ribbon and a faint watercolor design of a tree branch. He leaned closer. In the corner, a small signature was still legible beneath the aged plastic. Margaret Hayes. Robert's heart slammed against his ribs. It was impossible. He picked it up, hands trembling. His late wife had made these by hand for her elementary school class nearly 15 years ago, each one personalized, delicate, and filled with love. He remembered watching her at their old dining table surrounded by stacks of cardstock and watercolor brushes, humming to herself. She had made them for students who needed more than just words in a book. They needed to feel seen. He whispered aloud, "Where did this come from?" A soft knock interrupted his spiral. Ella stood in the doorway, clutching her backpack. Owen trailed behind, his cheeks pink from the morning chill. Robert quickly composed himself, slipping the bookmark into his coat pocket. "Good morning, kids," he said, rising to meet them. "We brought books," Owen said, lifting a cloth tote nearly bursting at the seams. "Dad likes it when Ella reads." "I do the voices," Ella added proudly, sitting beside her father and opening The Wind in the Willows. "This one's his favorite." Robert stepped back, letting the scene unfold. Owen dragged a chair closer and took out a crayon drawing. 3 stick figures under a tree, each holding books. "That's us," he explained. "Dad, Ella, and me." "And who's this?" Robert asked gently, pointing to a 4th figure standing slightly apart. Owen looked up. "That's the man who helped. I didn't know how to draw you yet." Robert chuckled softly, touched beyond words. When Ella finished reading, they all went downstairs to the hospital cafe. The kids devoured blueberry muffins and sipped hot chocolate like it was the most luxurious thing in the world. "How long have you had that bookmark?" Robert asked casually as they settled in. Ella glanced at her bag. "Since Mom passed. She said a lady at her old school gave it to her when she was scared to read out loud, said it made her brave." Robert's breath caught. "Do you know the name of that lady?" Ella shook her head. "Just that she had soft hair and painted trees on paper. Mom said she made her feel safe." Robert looked away, blinking fast. His late wife had been that woman. Margaret had taught in the Bronx for 3 years before they'd moved to the suburbs. She always said teaching was about planting seeds in forgotten soil. Now, somehow, her compassion had rippled forward into these children's lives. Back at Hayes Global, Robert sat at his desk and stared out the window. He wasn't thinking about quarterly earnings or growth projections. His thoughts were consumed by the weight of invisible threads, how one bookmark, one act of kindness, had circled back to him. Later that afternoon, Robert returned to the hospital with something special. He waited until Ella and Owen were alone in the room with their dad, then gently knocked and entered. "I brought a gift." He handed them a wooden box, carefully carved, simple but elegant. "I made this in high school," he explained, "back when I thought I'd be a carpenter like my grandfather." Owen opened the box and gasped. Inside were small compartments, one for crayons, one for bookmarks, and one for notes. "You built this?" he asked, wide-eyed. Robert nodded. "I haven't made anything by hand in decades, but I thought, your dad might like it when he wakes up. He'll need a place to keep his tools when he's better." Ella's eyes glistened. "Thank you, Mr. Robert." He knelt beside them. "You can call me Robert, or whatever you feel comfortable with." "Can we call you friend?" Owen asked shyly. Robert smiled, his voice thick. "I'd like that very much." As they placed the bookmark carefully in its new home, Robert felt something inside him shift. The walls he'd built after Margaret's death were cracking, and from the fragments, something new was growing. Not an obligation, a beginning. It was nearing dusk when Robert stood at the hospital window, watching the amber sun stretch long shadows across the city skyline. The warmth of the previous visit lingered with him, Ella's clear voice reading Owen's shy questions, and that haunting bookmark that still rested in his coat pocket. A decade had passed since Margaret's death, yet here was a thread, impossibly intact, stitched into a stranger's life. He turned from the window just as his phone buzzed. It was a message from Dr. Halperin, the cardiac specialist he'd called in the night before. "Mr. Hayes, John's condition is operable but urgent. We'll need consent and transfer by morning." Robert wasted no time. He strode down the corridor, each step louder than the last, until he reached the front desk. "I need to speak with someone about patient John Carter. I'm assuming responsibility for his transfer." The nurse blinked, caught off guard by the urgency in his voice. "Your family?" Robert hesitated. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." 30 minutes later, paperwork flew across desks, calls were made, and arrangements finalized. Robert covered the costs without a second thought. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He was doing it for 2 children who had walked into his life and lit up corners he hadn't realized were dark. When he returned to John's room, Ella was sitting cross-legged on the windowsill, quietly drawing. Owen was curled in a chair, dozing under his coat. Ella looked up. Is Dad going to be okay? Robert approached gently, crouching down to meet her eyes. He's going to be moved to a different hospital tonight, one with a special heart center, the best doctors. Really? Her voice trembled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. I made a promise, remember? He said softly, and I don't break promises. She nodded, her lip quivering. Thank you, Robert. He touched her shoulder gently. You're very brave, you know that? That night, an ambulance moved John under discreet lights and a cloak of quiet urgency. Ella and Owen sat in the back seat of Robert's car, holding each other's hands. Robert drove in silence, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. It had been years since someone rode in the back seat of his car, years since a child's voice had echoed in his world. They arrived at Mount Sinai just past 10 p.m. The new room was bright, quiet, and sterile, but filled with possibility. As the nurses prepared John for additional scans, Ella and Owen stayed close, standing on tiptoe just to hold his hand. Robert lingered by the door, feeling something shift in the air. Later, after the children had fallen asleep in a makeshift couch bed beside their father, Robert sat with the surgeon. Charts, risk factors, timelines. He listened intently, his mind not calculating percentages like he did in boardrooms, but weighing something far more human. Friday morning, the doctor confirmed. It won't be easy, but we've done harder. Robert nodded. Whatever he needs. He walked the quiet hospital corridors alone for a while, stopping at the chapel. Empty. Still. A stained glass window glowed faintly with the last light of day. He sat in a pew and pulled out the bookmark once more. Margaret, he whispered aloud, not for the first time, if you had anything to do with this. Thank you. The next morning brought cinnamon rolls, apple juice, and a small cup of strong coffee. Robert returned early with breakfast, only to find Ella already awake, brushing Owen's hair with her fingers to wake him gently. Morning, she said. We didn't want to miss you. He handed her a bag. Fresh from my favorite bakery. Owen's eyes lit up. You have a favorite bakery? I do, Robert said, smiling. And now I have favorite customers. They ate together, cross-legged on the floor, using books as trays. Owen told a story about how he once tried to build a birdhouse using only glue and cardboard. Ella rolled her eyes and said it collapsed on the first windy day. Robert laughed, genuinely, heartily, the way he hadn't in years. He had almost forgotten what unfiltered joy sounded like. As the day wore on, Robert made phone calls. Not to his assistant or stock analysts, but to local social workers, therapists, and educational coordinators. He wanted Ella and Owen to have options. Safety, structure, not just charity, but the foundation for something lasting. That afternoon, as the sun poured golden light across the room, Owen climbed onto the hospital bed beside his father and whispered, "We brought you someone who cares." John stirred faintly. His eyes fluttered open. "Ella," he rasped. "Owen." Robert's breath caught. The kids jumped up, calling for the nurse, tears springing from their eyes. John's gaze moved slowly, finally landing on Robert. And though his lips were too dry to speak, the gratitude in his eyes said everything. Robert stepped forward and took his hand. "Hang on, John," he said. "You've got a family waiting for you, and a second chance." For the first time in a long time, Robert Hayes didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man coming home. The waiting room at Mount Sinai buzzed with quiet urgency, yet within the private cardiac suite, time seemed to slow. John was sedated, prepped for surgery, and the silence around him grew heavier by the hour. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow on the walls, but nothing could dim the warmth Robert felt sitting beside Ella and Owen. He had stayed the night, on a couch too small for his tall frame, in clothes wrinkled from sleep, and a mind burdened with more questions than answers. Yet for the first time in years, his heart didn't feel hollow. It felt needed. Ella stirred first, blinking sleepily. Her eyes fell on the quiet beeping machines around her father's bed, and she instinctively reached for his hand. "Is today the day?" she asked quietly. Robert nodded gently. "Yes, sweetheart. The doctors will take him into surgery this morning." Owen, still curled beside his sister under a hospital blanket, stretched out and sat up groggily. "Will it hurt?" "No," Robert said, crouching beside them. "They'll help him sleep through it, and when he wakes up, it'll be like getting his heart back." The children leaned into him, their heads resting against his shoulders. It was a strange kind of intimacy, new and tentative, but deeply real. Around 9 a.m., Dr. Halperin entered. His eyes were tired but kind, and his voice steady. "We're ready." Ella and Owen each kissed their father's cheek. Robert stood still as John was wheeled away, a subtle ache forming in his chest, as if part of himself were being pulled down that corridor too. They waited. The hours blurred, marked only by vending machine snacks, crayon drawings scattered across the floor, and hushed reassurances from nurses. Ella drew a house with a big porch, flowers in the window, and 3 stick figures on the front steps. Robert paused when she handed it to him. "You think we'll all live together?" he asked, surprised by the swell in his throat. Ella nodded confidently. "You're already part of the picture." Just after noon, the surgeon reappeared. The room froze. Robert rose immediately, his voice caught in the tension. "How is he?" Dr. Halperin smiled. "The procedure went well. His heart responded. We'll monitor him closely, but it looks very good." Ella burst into tears first, her little shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Owen hugged her, trying to be strong but weeping too. Robert knelt and embraced them both, his own eyes stinging. Relief, joy, and something deeper pulsed through his veins, something like redemption. Later that evening, when they were finally allowed into the recovery room, John was awake. Weak, but awake. His voice was raspy, his words barely audible, but when he said, "Ella, Owen," the children broke into relieved smiles and ran to his bedside. Robert stood back, giving them space, but John looked up, locking eyes with him. "You," he rasped. "You stayed?" Robert stepped closer, placing a steady hand on the bed rail. "Of course I did. They led me here, and now I don't want to be anywhere else." John closed his eyes briefly. "Why?" Robert hesitated. How do you explain a hollow life being filled by 2 little voices and 1 brave act of trust? "Because they remind me of someone I loved," he finally said. "Someone who once gave me the courage to hope again. Your children carry that same light." John nodded slowly, too tired to reply, but his fingers squeezed Robert's weakly, a silent acknowledgement. That night, back at the hospital apartment Robert arranged for the kids to rest in, Owen brushed his teeth beside Robert at the sink. He glanced up through the mirror. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," Robert said. "Why did you help us?" Robert paused, then answered honestly. "Because I saw you. I really saw you, and I couldn't walk away from that." Owen looked down, rinsed, and then said quietly, "I want to be like you when I grow up, but maybe with more hair." Robert laughed so loudly it echoed off the tile. The tension broke, and he ruffled Owen's head with a chuckle. "Fair enough, kid." Meanwhile, Ella sat on the bed, legs swinging. She held a small photo frame Robert had placed beside the nightstand. Inside was a picture of her, Owen, and their dad at the hospital window. She stared at it with a thoughtful expression. "Do you miss your wife?" she asked suddenly when Robert joined her. The question took his breath away. "Yes," he said softly, sitting beside her. "Every single day." "Was she nice?" The kindest person I've ever known." Ella tilted her head. "I think she would have liked us." "I think she would have loved you," Robert whispered. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the worn bookmark again. "I wanted you to have this. It was my mom's before she passed." Robert took it delicately. His eyes scanned the soft curve of the pressed flowers inside, and the initials scrawled in faded ink. M.H. Margaret Hayes. He didn't speak. Couldn't. Ella leaned against him, yawning. "You feel like family now." Robert held her gently, the bookmark pressed to his heart. In that moment, he no longer felt like a guest in someone else's story. He was finally home. The next morning, the sun filtered through gauzy hospital curtains, casting long golden strips across the floor. In the quiet of the room, Robert sat beside John's bed, the children still asleep in the family room nearby. John looked pale, but stronger. His voice had steadied. His eyes, once dulled by pain, now carried a wary gratitude. Robert broke the silence. "They're extraordinary kids, brave, kind, more resilient than anyone their age should have to be." John nodded, swallowing hard. "Their mother was the brave one," he whispered. "She taught them to look out for each other, even when I couldn't stand on my own." Robert glanced down at the bookmark in his hands. The initials M.H. still etched faintly into the paper. He had barely slept. The memory it stirred wrapping around him like an old ache. "Where did Ella get this?" he asked carefully. John looked at it and blinked, his brow furrowed. "That old thing? It belonged to my late wife, Marjorie. She was a librarian before she got sick. Always slipped bookmarks into our books, even cereal boxes," he said with a tired smile. Robert's hands trembled slightly. "Marjorie Hayes?" "Yes, Marjorie Ann Hayes. You knew her?" Robert's breath caught. "She was my sister." The room fell into stunned silence. John sat up a little straighter, blinking. "Your sister?" Robert nodded slowly, emotions colliding in his chest. "We lost touch years ago. After college, she moved across the country and never returned my calls. I didn't know what happened. I thought she didn't want to be found." John's voice cracked. "She talked about you, always. Said her brother was brilliant, stubborn, and didn't forgive easily, but she hoped, one day, you'd remember the locket she gave you and come find her." "I still have it," Robert said softly, reaching for his wallet and pulling out a tiny, time-worn photo of a teenage Marjorie. He laid it on the table next to John's IV bag. "I never stopped missing her." John wiped his eyes, emotion overtaking him. "She died 3 years ago. Heart failure. We'd barely been getting by after she got sick. I sold my shop, took jobs where I could, but after she passed, everything crumbled. And now? Now you're here." Robert turned toward the door as soft footsteps padded in. Ella and Owen stood there, confused but sensing the weight of the moment. "Is something wrong?" Owen asked. "No," Robert said, kneeling and pulling them close. "Something's finally right." He looked at them as if seeing them through new eyes, his niece and nephew, blood of his blood, pieces of the sister he'd lost but never stopped loving. Tears welled in his eyes and he pulled them into his arms. "I'm your uncle," he whispered, his voice breaking, "and I should have found you a long time ago." Ella blinked slowly. "You knew our mom?" "She was my sister," Robert replied, voice thick with emotion. "And you both. You're a miracle." Owen looked at his dad, who nodded faintly with a soft smile. "It's okay," John murmured. "You can love him too." They all embraced, the silence between them no longer hollow but whole, filled with memory, longing, and healing. Later that day, Robert made calls, important ones. He didn't just move John to a better room. He booked the best cardiac recovery team in the state. He arranged for Ella and Owen to be tutored privately while staying at his guest residence, a charming townhouse in the heart of the city, filled with plants and quiet bookshelves, just the way Marjorie used to describe her dream home. And when they arrived, wide-eyed and hesitant, Robert knelt by the fireplace with a key in hand. "This house was built for someone like your mom," he said, voice tender. "Now, it's for you." Ella clutched the bookmark tightly, her voice small. "Do we really belong here?" "You belong wherever there's love," Robert answered gently, "and this place is full of it now." Owen looked around and pointed toward the piano in the corner. "Mom used to play that song, Claire de Lune. Do you know it?" Robert smiled, walking over and pressing a key softly. "I used to sit outside her door while she played it. Let's learn it again. Together." That evening, the house came alive for the first time in years. Laughter echoed through the hallways. Warm soup simmered in the kitchen. Ella practiced reading aloud as Robert turned pages, and Owen tried building a wooden airplane in the den. Determined and a little messy, John, resting in the spare bedroom, listened to the distant sounds of joy and wept quietly. Not from pain, but from relief. That night, as Robert tucked the children into bed, Owen looked up. "Are you staying every night?" "I will, if you want me to," Robert said. Ella reached out and took his hand. "Even after Dad's better?" Robert kissed her forehead. "Especially then," she whispered, "Mom would be happy." Robert's voice shook as he replied, "She is." Outside, the wind rustled gently through the trees. Inside, a family was being rebuilt, not with shared blood alone, but with unspoken forgiveness, rediscovered connection, and the kind of love that reaches across years of silence to say, "You were never really lost." The sky over the city had softened to lavender by the time Robert stepped out onto the townhouse balcony. Below, lights blinked in warm windows, and somewhere a piano played faintly. Inside, Ella and Owen had drifted off to sleep under flannel quilts, surrounded by books and stuffed animals they'd picked out earlier that day. A sense of peace lingered, but Robert's heart hadn't fully quieted. His phone buzzed. "Mr. Hayes," said Dr. Chen's voice on the other end. "John responded well to the new medication, but will need a more aggressive treatment plan. The next 2 weeks are critical." Robert nodded slowly, fingers tightening on the railing. "Do whatever it takes. I'll cover it." He hung up and looked up at the stars, 1,000 quiet questions pressing against his chest. He had spent years building empires, restoring failing companies, and walking out of boardrooms with billion-dollar deals. But none of that had prepared him for the raw ache of love or the fragile weight of a child's trust. The door creaked behind him. John stood there, leaning slightly against the frame, pale but dressed in his own clothes at last. "Am I interrupting?" Robert turned, surprised. "No, you should be resting." John stepped forward, slow and cautious. "Couldn't sleep. The silence in hospitals always made me think too much." Robert gestured to the wicker chair across from him. "I know the feeling." They sat quietly for a few moments. Then John exhaled. "You've done more for us in a week than I've managed in years." Robert shook his head. "I'm just trying to do what I should have done a long time ago. If I hadn't turned my back on Marjorie—" "You didn't turn your back," John said gently. "She didn't want pity, even from family. That was her pride, and her pain." They fell silent again, but this time it was companionable. Two men sitting in the shadows of memory, trying to build something real from the ruins. John finally spoke. "What happens now?" Robert looked up. "We take it one promise at a time." The following morning, Owen tugged at Robert's sleeve during breakfast. "Can we go to your office today? You said you had a bookshelf made of glass." Robert chuckled. "Sure, but only if you promise not to run around the elevators again." "I was testing gravity," Owen protested earnestly. and even John couldn't help but laugh. At the sleek downtown headquarters of Hayes and Sterling, heads turned as Robert walked in, not alone for once, but flanked by a wide-eyed pair of twins. The front receptionist blinked. "Mr. Hayes, your guests?" "My family," Robert said, placing a gentle hand on Owen's shoulder. "They're with me." In the elevator, Ella looked up. "Are you famous?" Robert smiled. "Some people think money makes you important, but being remembered by the people you love, that's what really matters." By noon, Owen was seated at Robert's giant desk, spinning in the chair with glee, while Ella carefully arranged a row of books along the glass shelf. Robert watched from across the room, heart full in a way he hadn't felt since he was a teenager, listening to Marjorie play Debussy in the next room. That afternoon, he took them to lunch at a quiet rooftop garden above one of his restaurants. The chef brought out fresh tomato soup and sourdough grilled cheese, Owen's favorite. Halfway through lunch, Ella looked up with a small, serious voice. "Uncle Robert, do you think our mom knows we're okay?" Robert's throat tightened. "I think she knows. I think she sees everything, especially how brave you've both been." Ella nodded solemnly. "Then I'll keep being brave." Just then, Robert's assistant approached hesitantly. "Sorry, sir. The board has called an emergency session. They're concerned about your recent personal time. There's pressure from investors." Robert looked at Ella and Owen, then back at his assistant. "Tell them I'll meet them tomorrow. Right now, I have more important things to do." "But, sir," he stood up. "Tomorrow. No exceptions." As the assistant backed away, Robert turned back to the twins. "Let's get dessert. Have either of you ever tried lemon soufflé?" Owen grinned. "Is that the one that looks like a volcano?" "Exactly." That night, after John returned to the townhouse from a follow-up appointment, he found the twins asleep on the sofa, curled up on either side of Robert, who had also dozed off. A storybook lay open on Robert's chest, its pages rustling gently from the fan. John watched for a long time, then quietly picked up a blanket and covered them all. He stepped back, phone in hand, and took a photo. Not for social media, not for a scrapbook, just for memory, just in case one day they needed to remember where the healing began. He whispered, "Thank you, Marjorie." And the house, once silent and solemn, felt like it had a soul again. Late the next morning, as sunlight spilled gently through the townhouse windows, Ella sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a book that had lost its cover but not its charm. Robert sat across from her at the coffee table, watching her with quiet affection, sipping tea he hadn't realized he was learning to enjoy. She looked up suddenly. "Uncle Robert, can I show you something special?" He nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." Ella reached into her tiny backpack, faded and fraying at the edges. From a side pocket, she pulled out a laminated bookmark, faded rose in color, the edges slightly curled, the quote inside smudged from time and use. She walked over, carefully placing it into Robert's open hand. "This is Mommy's favorite. She said it always helped her feel safe." Robert turned the bookmark over slowly. His heart nearly stopped. Printed in delicate cursive, barely visible now, was a quote from Jane Austen. But it wasn't the words that gripped his chest. It was the floral border, the soft blue ink, the hand-trimmed edges, and the initials in the bottom corner, H. Margaret Hayes. His wife. No, not wife. His late wife. The woman who disappeared years ago during her final project with the Literacy Foundation. He remembered the day she ordered these bookmarks, hundreds of them, to leave behind in libraries and community centers. "A book," she had said, "can find its reader the way love finds the lonely." Robert hadn't seen one since her funeral. He blinked hard. "Ella, where did your dad get this?" "I don't know. It was in a book Mommy used to read to us," she said quietly. "She told us if we ever felt scared, we should keep it close." He held the bookmark tighter, pulse racing. Do you still have that book?" Ella ran to her room. A moment later, she returned with a battered hardcover titled Where the Ferns Grow. Robert recognized it instantly. It had once sat on Margaret's nightstand. When John returned home from his doctor's visit that afternoon, Robert met him on the porch. "Can we talk?" John nodded, seeing the intensity in Robert's eyes. Inside, over coffee, Robert placed the bookmark on the table. John's expression faltered. "I didn't know. I never connected the name." Robert spoke gently, but firmly. "That belonged to my late wife, Margaret. She distributed them when she worked with the Children's Literacy Initiative 10 years ago." John looked down. "She helped my wife, Rachel. She was the one who taught her how to read and filled our first bookcase. She used to say, 'That woman saved her.'" Robert nodded slowly. That woman was my world. A thick silence stretched between them, heavy with memories and new understanding. "She must have left the bookmark behind when she visited," John murmured. "Rachel kept it like a treasure." Robert swallowed hard. "So, somehow, the children I just promised to protect were already connected to the woman I loved most." John's voice caught. Then maybe it was meant to be. That night, the twins insisted on reading to Robert. They curled beside him on the couch, each holding half the book. As they read, sometimes pausing to sound out tricky words, Robert felt a peace settle inside him that had long eluded his restless heart. "Want to know a secret?" Ella asked after they finished. He smiled. "Always." She leaned closer and whispered, "You're kind of like the dad in the stories. The quiet ones who make everything better." His throat tightened, the compliment far more precious than any award or newspaper headline. Later, after tucking the children into bed, Robert stood in the hallway, staring at the framed photo of Margaret he'd placed beside the door. She smiled back at him, eyes wise and warm. "I think," he whispered to the photo, "you found your way back to me." The next morning, Robert arrived early at the hospital with Ella and Owen in tow. They held his hands as they stepped into John's private room. To their surprise, John was awake. "Daddy!" the twins cried, rushing forward. Robert stood at the door, watching with emotion swelling in his chest. John reached out for them, arms trembling. "I missed you both so much." Ella beamed. "We brought your favorite book." She placed the Where the Ferns Grow volume beside him. "And look who's with us," Owen added proudly. "Uncle Robert." John looked up, meeting Robert's gaze with sincere gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Robert stepped forward slowly. "There's something else. When you're strong enough, I'd like to talk about a long-term plan, not just for the kids, for all of us." John blinked, surprised. "You'd still want to be part of this?" "I don't just want to be," Robert said gently. "I already am." They shook hands. Two men, once strangers, now brothers in something deeper than blood. As they turned to leave the room, Owen looked back. "Daddy," he said seriously, "we're going to build birdhouses again when you're better, okay?" John laughed softly. "You bet we are." Ella reached for Robert's hand. "And we'll make soup. Uncle Robert's learning." "Learning fast," Robert said with a wink. As they stepped into the hallway, he glanced back once more at the man in the bed, the book beside him, and the bookmark that had found its way home. Sometimes, love doesn't knock. It slips in quietly, on a page, in a memory, through the voice of a child. And when it does, nothing stays the same. The autumn wind brushed through the open window of Robert's study as soft golden light painted the walls. The townhouse, once hushed and cold, now echoed faintly with laughter, footsteps, and the turn of pages from books that hadn't seen light in years. It had been 2 weeks since John was moved to a rehabilitation room at the Cardiac Recovery Center, and every day since, Robert had brought Ella and Owen to visit. But this morning, it was different. The twins were home. Home in every way that mattered now. Robert stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, a comically oversized apron tied over his shirt. He frowned at the cookbook propped on the counter. "Uncle Robert," Owen said, appearing beside him with a wooden spoon and a hopeful grin. "You put the noodles in after the broth." "Right," Robert muttered sheepishly. "After. Got it." Ella leaned over the kitchen island, resting her chin on her hands. "It's okay. Mommy used to say good soup takes patience and a little love." Robert smiled, warmed by the memory, even though it wasn't his. "Then I suppose we're halfway there." The three of them stood around the stovetop, stirring, tasting, adjusting. The scent of chicken and herbs filled the townhouse. Robert, once oblivious to domestic joy, now clung to these moments as lifelines. He no longer thought of quarterly projections while chopping carrots. He thought of how Ella's nose wrinkled when she tried something sour, or how Owen tried to flip everything with a spatula, even toast. The doorbell rang. Ella raced to answer it, nearly slipping on the rug. Standing there was Ms. Alvarez, the social worker who had visited the hospital weeks earlier. She stepped inside, carrying a folder tucked under her arm, her expression calm but unreadable. Robert straightened his back, suddenly nervous. "Good morning, Ms. Alvarez." "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." She glanced at the kids, who now peeked around the corner. "Mind if we speak privately?" Robert led her into the living room. The couch still bore evidence of the twins' recent coloring session. Stray crayons and a piece of construction paper that read, "We Soup." She smiled softly. "They seem happy." "They are," Robert said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't expect it, but they filled something in me I didn't know was hollow." Ms. Alvarez opened the folder. "John has submitted a letter of intent. He wants you to be considered for legal guardianship of Ella and Owen, should anything happen to him again." Robert blinked. I didn't know. He says he trusts you, and the twins have made their feelings very clear." Robert's throat tightened. "I would be honored." She studied him for a long moment. "You know, this comes with more than just school pickups and bedtime stories." "I do," he said firmly. "It's not about saving anyone. It's about staying, choosing them, every single day." Ms. Alvarez nodded, satisfied. "Then, let's begin the process." Later that afternoon, Robert brought the children to the hospital for another visit. John looked better. His skin, no longer ghost pale, his eyes brighter. There was hope in his voice now, not just fatigue. Ella jumped onto the chair beside him. "We made soup," Owen chimed in, "and Uncle Robert only burned the toast once." John laughed. "He's learning fast." Robert stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. "I brought something." John raised an eyebrow as Robert handed it to him. Inside were 3 handcrafted bookmarks, each different, but sharing the same design around the edges, Margaret's original floral print. On each was a quote, chosen carefully by the children. "This one's mine," Ella said proudly. "Sometimes home isn't a place, it's a person." John looked at Owens. "Family is the story that never ends." "And the last?" Robert smiled gently. "You don't find family, you build it, moment by moment." John's voice caught. "They're beautiful." "They're ours," Robert said simply. That evening, back home, Ella tucked herself into bed, arms around a soft teddy bear. "Uncle Robert?" He looked up from her dresser, where he was folding the new pajamas she picked out herself. "Yes, sweetheart?" She hesitated, then asked, "Do you think Mommy would be proud of us?" Robert sat beside her, brushing her hair back gently. "I think she'd be proud every day. Of your kindness, your courage, your love." Ella nodded slowly, eyes heavy. "Will you be here tomorrow?" He wrapped her in a gentle hug. "I'll be here every day you want me to." From the next room, Owen called out, "Uncle!" "Robert, next time we make soup, can I be the head chef?" Robert chuckled. "Only if you promise not to toast the noodles." As he turned off the lights, a soft peace settled into the home. It no longer echoed with loneliness. It breathed with love, laughter, and the smell of slightly too salty soup. In the hallway, Robert passed Margaret's photograph again. For once, he didn't feel the ache of missing her. He felt her presence, in the joy of the children, in the strength of John, in the quiet comfort of choosing to stay. Some stories, he realized, didn't need rewriting. They just needed new chapters. The rain came softly that morning, tapping gently against the windows of the townhouse like a long-lost friend knocking to come in. Robert stood by the front door, adjusting his coat collar, glancing once more at the hallway where two tiny backpacks hung neatly beside his own. There was something different in the air, an energy he hadn't known in years. It pulsed through him like music. John was coming home today. The moment Robert parked at the cardiac rehab center, Ella and Owen shot out of the back seat, their excitement bubbling over. Ella carried a balloon shaped like a heart with the words, "Welcome home, Daddy," and Owen held a handmade wooden sign with a lopsided drawing of their family, including Robert. The nurse smiled knowingly as she led them to John's room. He sat in a wheelchair, a soft flannel blanket draped over his lap, color returned to his cheeks, though his body still moved slower than before. "Daddy!" Ella cried, rushing into his arms. Owen followed, nearly knocking over the welcome sign as he gripped his father's waist tightly. John chuckled hoarsely, his arms trembling slightly as they wrapped around both children. "I missed you two, like the sky misses the sun at night," he whispered. Robert stepped back, watching the reunion with quiet reverence. For weeks he had been the steady hand, the guiding voice, but today was about letting John take the center of the stage again. John's eyes lifted to meet Robert's. "You kept them safe." "I just gave them room to shine," Robert replied gently. A silence hung between them. Not awkward, but full of respect, full of shared weight and new beginnings. Later that afternoon, back at Robert's townhouse, the living room turned into a spontaneous celebration. Owen played a chaotic version of charades while Ella insisted on reading a story aloud. Even though she couldn't stop giggling halfway through, John sat nestled on the sofa with a pillow behind his back, watching his children as though trying to memorize the moment. "I can't thank you enough," he said to Robert when they found a moment alone in the kitchen. "I left the hospital expecting paperwork. I came back to a life." Robert nodded, pouring 2 cups of tea. "It was never charity. From the moment I read that letter they brought me, I knew this wasn't just a favor." John studied him, something like wonder in his eyes. "They trust you. Ella's always been shy with men, but she sings around you like she used to with Margaret." Robert's heart clenched at the name. "Margaret," he repeated softly. "I haven't heard someone say it aloud in years." "I never told them," John said quietly, "about her being your wife. I figured if it was meant to come out, it would." "It did," Robert murmured, "in a bookmark." John smiled. "She would have liked you being part of this." "I think she sent me to them," Robert whispered. That evening, as dinner wound down, the doorbell rang. Robert opened it to find Ms. Alvarez, the social worker, her expression unreadable again, but not cold. "I came to deliver something," she said, stepping inside and pulling out a sealed envelope. "The judge approved John's request to grant you co-guardianship." Robert blinked, unsure he heard her correctly. "Co-guardianship? You're not just a temporary fixture," she said. John insisted. "Legally, emotionally, you're family now." Across the room, John raised his cup of tea with a nod. Robert slowly sat down, overwhelmed. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Ella climbed into his lap, curling up against him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Does that mean you're really ours?" she asked softly. "I think it means," Robert replied, hugging her close. "I've always been." Ms. Alvarez smiled. "Some families are built by blood, some by choice. Yours is both." Night crept in, and with it came the glow of string lights twinkling outside the townhouse. Inside, Owen and Ella fell asleep on the rug, a picture book open between them. Robert covered them gently with a soft blanket, brushing back a lock of hair from Ella's cheek. John stood nearby, leaning on his cane. "Think you're ready for this long term?" he asked, half teasing, half sincere. "I think I need it more than they do," Robert replied. "They gave me a purpose I forgot I had." "Then maybe we were all meant to find each other," John said. Robert nodded. Maybe this is what healing looks like, not fixing the past, but choosing to build something better with what's left. He turned off the lamp, and the room fell into a warm hush, like a heart slowing down to rest after years of running. Outside, the rain had stopped. A single star glimmered above the city, like someone was watching and smiling. The morning light filtered in through the half-closed blinds, painting long golden stripes across the hardwood floor. In the quiet living room, Robert watched as Ella and Owen stirred under the blanket they'd fallen asleep beneath the night before. Their peaceful faces reminded him why this mattered so much, why this wasn't just a chapter in his life, but the whole book rewritten. John, still recovering, had taken to spending mornings in the sunroom. Robert found him there now, slowly turning the pages of an old woodworking magazine while sipping chamomile tea. He looked better, steadier. "You sure you're okay with this?" Robert asked, gently breaking the silence. "Sharing the load, I mean." John looked up and smiled faintly. "Robert, I didn't ask you to be their co-guardian because I wanted help. I asked because they need more love, not less. And honestly, so do you." Robert exhaled, emotion catching in his throat. "I never thought I'd have something like this again." "You didn't find something," John said with quiet certainty. "You chose it." That same afternoon, the three of them, Robert, John, and Miss Alvarez, sat in the family court building downtown. The room was unassuming, sterile, but filled with the gravity of what was about to happen. The judge was kind-eyed but firm. "So, Mr. Hayes, you understand the responsibilities of legal co-guardianship?" "Yes, Your Honor," Robert replied. "I do." "Do you accept full commitment to the children's well-being, education, and upbringing jointly with Mr. Carpenter?" "I wouldn't be here if I didn't," Robert said softly. Ella and Owen waited outside with a court officer who let them color while the adults handled the big stuff. When Robert emerged from the room, paperwork in hand, Ella jumped up. "Did it happen?" she asked breathlessly. Robert knelt to meet her eye. "It did." She squealed and threw her arms around him. Owen joined with a quiet, proud hug. "We have two dads now," he said, matter-of-factly. Robert and John exchanged a glance, both men humbled by the weight of that truth. Later that week, Robert stood in a modest field outside the city. He looked out over the green stretch of land once intended for another commercial development. But now, it would be home. A construction crew had already started clearing the area. Robert was building a house, not a mansion, but a home where John, Ella, and Owen could live comfortably. A place with open windows, space to run, a workshop for John, and a reading nook for Ella and Owen. The foreman approached him. "Plans are locked in. You sure you don't want the designer kitchen with all the luxury upgrades?" Robert smiled. "No. What I want is a real dining table. One big enough for bedtime snacks, science projects, and holiday dinners that go late into the night." Back at the townhouse, John was finally well enough to cook again, even if he needed a stool beside the stove. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen. Robert entered just as Owen, wearing an apron 2 sizes too big, dropped a spoon into the sauce with a clang. "Sorry," Owen called out, embarrassed. "No harm," John said with a grin. "That's how you learn." Robert slipped off his jacket. "Need a third cook?" John handed him a whisk. "Thought you'd never ask." The three of them worked like a unit, messy, noisy, joyful. And when they sat down to eat, with Ella reading a poem she wrote about 2 dads and 1 big heart, Robert had to look away to blink back tears. "I used to think family was something that happened to you," he said after she finished. "Now I know. It's something you say yes to." That evening, as the kids were tucked in, Robert found himself back in the sunroom, holding a letter he'd written to Margaret years ago but never sent. He didn't read it. He just folded it gently and tucked it into a small frame behind the bookmark Ella had given him. He placed it on the mantel, beside a new family photo taken the day before. John in the center, Ella and Owen on each side, Robert standing behind them, hands resting on both their shoulders. For the first time in decades, the photo didn't feel staged. It felt lived in, home. Spring arrived gently. The trees around the new house were beginning to bloom, and the wind carried the scent of lilac and freshly cut wood. It was moving day, and for once, chaos felt like celebration. Boxes were stacked along the driveway, each labeled with names in blocky handwriting. Ella's books, Owen's tools, Dad's kitchen stuff. Robert stood by the porch, sleeves rolled up, laughing as Owen ran by dragging a model sailboat and shouting something about lake testing. Inside, John adjusted frames on the living room wall while Ella carefully unfolded a quilt and laid it on the couch. She smoothed the fabric gently, pausing as her fingers brushed the edge of a stitched heart in the center. "Grandma made this for Mom," she said softly. "It's the only thing we brought from the old place that still smells like home." Robert looked over from the kitchen, where he was unpacking a box of mismatched mugs. "Then it belongs right where everyone can see it," he said warmly. They shared a quiet moment, wrapped not in silence but in understanding. That evening, the whole house buzzed with the soft clatter of plates and the laughter of shared memories. Dinner was simple. John's famous roast chicken, roasted carrots, and Owen's mashed potatoes, with far too much butter, just how Ella liked them. At the head of the table sat Robert. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His smile said everything. As dessert, chocolate pudding with whipped cream, was served, Ella reached into her backpack and pulled out a drawing. She slid it across the table toward Robert. "I made this for you," she said shyly. Robert unfolded it and gasped. The picture showed 4 people standing under a tree, just like the one by the mailbox outside. 2 kids, 1 man with a beard, and 1 in a suit with glasses. Robert could recognize himself, even in crayon. Above them, a banner floated in the sky. It read, "Home is where someone stays." His eyes welled. "Do you like it?" Ella asked, her voice uncertain. Robert cleared his throat. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the kids were tucked in, Robert stepped outside. The porch light bathed the yard in a soft amber glow. He looked up at the stars, his heart steady. Footsteps approached. John. "You okay?" John asked, settling into the chair beside him. Robert nodded slowly. "For the first time in a long time, yeah." They sat quietly for a while, just 2 men who'd come through different storms and found the same safe shore. "I never thanked you," John said suddenly, "for giving us more than just a second chance." Robert shook his head. "You did, when you trusted me with your children." From inside, they heard soft giggles. Ella and Owen had snuck downstairs for one more bedtime snack. Robert grinned. "Sounds like they're still hungry." "Always," John said with a chuckle. "Want me to handle it?" "No," Robert said, rising. "This one's mine." In the kitchen, Robert found the twins sitting cross-legged on the floor, sharing peanut butter from the jar with 2 spoons. "You two have no shame," he teased gently. Ella held out a spoon. "Want some?" Robert laughed and sat beside them. "Only if I get a bedtime story." Owen perked up. "Can we do the one about the lion who found a family in the woods?" Robert nodded. "Only if you two tell it this time." They did, dramatically, joyfully, with voices that filled the room with warmth. And when the story was done, Robert whispered, "You know, I used to think my story was already written, but maybe the best part was just waiting for the right chapter." That night, as Robert turned off the lights and walked past their rooms, he paused. He peeked into Ella's, where she clutched the family quilt like a lifeline. He peeked into Owen's, where a wooden sailboat rested beside his pillow. He walked to the end of the hallway, where a small frame hung, a bookmark encased in glass. The same one Ella had shown him at the hospital, the same one his late wife had once owned. Next to it now hung the crayon drawing, protected behind acrylic. Together, they told a story only he could fully understand. A reminder of what he had lost, and what he had gained. He didn't need wealth, he didn't need boardrooms or luxury penthouses. He needed this. A house where footsteps echoed with laughter. A life filled with bedtime stories, burnt toast, school pickups, and quiet nights on the porch. He needed a family. And now he had one. Forever.